Welcome to Liminal Radio. I'm Gray.
And I'm Hatter, and I want to welcome you to another Rabbit Holes episode where we will discuss something a little shorter and a little more specific.
Today we're going to be talking about our top 5 underrated creepypastas. And I am so excited to go into this because there are the creepypastas that everyone knows. Slender Man, Jeff the Killer, which is not one of the best ones, but it is one of the best knowns. And there's just so many that everyone knows, and I want to get a chance to tell you guys about the ones that are fantastic that are less talked about.
And we have 5, in no particular order, great creepypastas that maybe flew under the radar when they came out. What do you have, Gray?
I have 3, and these are going to be, I don't know that completely unknown, but they are definitely less known. If you've heard of any of these, make sure you let us know in the comments. Mine are Why Babies Are Born Screaming, Sloppy Joes, and Aquarium.
And I've got 2 that maybe a little better known than those, but still, I don't see them talked about nearly enough. Both by the same author, one Elias Witherow, who we would love to have on the podcast someday as a guest star.
Elias, if you're listening, we'd love to have you.
But my stories are Feed the Pig, which is a part of the Black Farm series of stories, and The Third Parent, which is the first in a series of stories about a character named Tommy Taffy. May as well get this out of the way now. Trigger warnings for Tommy Taffy, literally friggin' everything.
Absolutely, especially for, and I can actually say the whole word because this isn't TikTok, for sexual assault. That is a big part of that story. So if that bothers you, either tap out now or when we get to that story.
Full disclosure, some of it does involve children.
Absolutely.
But I'll let you start, Gray, because mine are going to be a little bit longer to explain because I'm going to go a bit into the stories around them. I'll try to keep it brief, though.
All right, we'll start with Why Babies Are Born Screaming. This is a story about a person who works in the research lab at a college who starts helping one of his other friends who is essentially doing these kind of neuroscience experiments where they are essentially pointing a device, which I actually think is a real device, it's some kind of neurostimulator, at their brain, activating different parts of their brain and different neurons, and they point it at a part of their brain that is associated with memory, and they activate a memory that had been repressed. The idea here is that the memory that they activate is a memory we all have. And what happens is he sees this skinless man who is this really horrifying. They go into all this detail about how horrible he looks with no skin and how terrifying he is with a charnel house grin and all this kind of stuff. And turns out he remembers him because he had, of course, seen him before he was old enough to talk and really old enough to remember, because most of our memories come from about the time we're 4 or 5. These are our formative memories. And supposedly, before that, we all have memories of this faceless, skinless man following us around, whispering the secrets of the universe to us. And these secrets are these blasphemous truths we are not supposed to know. And he begins telling this guy these things again, which he had forgotten out of defense to keep his sanity. And that's kind of where that whole story goes. And then the creature starts following him around, but as soon as the thing is no longer activating his brain, he can't see it anymore. And him trying to suppress the memory yet again that supposedly all of us, before we were old enough to remember, were told these horrible, blasphemous secrets of the universe by this faceless man. And that's kind of what the story is about. And the horror here is very Lovecraftian. Huge Lovecraft feel because it's all about you becoming aware of things in the universe that you were not meant to know and how that can threaten and destroy your sanity. And I really like that vibe.
I'm personally a big fan of this story and that vibe, of course. Just the idea of, what you can't imagine or what you can imagine is worse than what you can actually see. I do have a few issues with the story. Like, my first question is, why is it a skinless man? I feel like what it should have been was something kind of indescribable, but that's a creepy image, that's a scary image, and it works. So it's not so much a complaint as just, something I might have done a little differently. And yeah, there is such a thing as, I don't know if you'd call it a neural stimulator. That's some sci-fi stuff, but they have done experiments in the past where they would put like a powerful magnet by somebody's brain. And let's say they put it by the occipital lobe or the striate cortex. That's the same thing, 2 different words for it. It's what helps you see. And they'll tell you before they put the magnet there, imagine a dog. You can imagine a dog. You know what a dog looks like, don't you, Gray? But they put the magnet there and it affects that part of the brain, and the person finds they can no longer imagine a dog until the magnet is removed. So it kind of plays on that a little bit.
Well, and the type of neurostimulation they're talking about is really related to that. And I'm not sure it is completely sci-fi. I think it may be something that exists because it's really just related to like an fMRI machine where they're actively watching your brain move and they can stimulate certain parts and watch it on an fMRI. So I'm not sure how out there it is. I at least know it's close enough to reality to be interesting for a story material anyway.
Oh yeah, and the more there's a certain level of detail. And we've talked about this before. That's perfect for a story like this. There's too little detail, too much detail. They found a perfect balance of what level of detail they needed to have for this to keep it scary, but not over explain and make it boring, but not under explain and make it hard to believe. Hey, you want to know why you don't have any memories before you're 4 or 5?
Why is that?
Well, Matt's gonna ruin it with his sci-fi, with his psychology knowledge. It's because 3, 4, 5 years old, that's when you start to develop advanced language skills. And your brain, part of what the way you store memories is language coded. It involves being able to have language and describe not only to others, but to yourself what you have seen. So those memories start to come like the early kind of amorphous blobbish memories you have from before that are so hard to grab a hold of because you don't have the words to describe it. You didn't have the words at the time.
That makes a lot of sense, and I really like that. And does weirdly, it's not exactly related, but it reminds me of the big discussion going on around the internet a little bit ago about how some people have an internal monologue and some people don't. Are you familiar with that?
I've heard the discussion before. I definitely have an internal monologue that often becomes external when I'm really deep in thought.
What's hilarious about that is me and Sharon both read that article at the same time and came home wanting to discuss it to each other. And me and her both saying to each other, "Yeah, did you read this? Isn't it so weird? Yeah, I can't believe." And she said, "I can't believe there are people who like actually have an internal monologue just like in a movie." And I'm like, "Wait, no. I can't believe there are people who don't have an internal monologue and just what, see fucking pictures or something?" Both of us did not realize the other person was part of the other group and that other people see the world that differently, and that was really cool.
And I would posit that the people who use like a more visual form of memory probably have earlier memories from their childhood.
Actually, that's an interesting theory. Let's check. Hey, Sharon,
Yes.
how old is your earliest memory?
By collaboration, I was 2.
Which is younger than most people have their earliest memory. So your theory plays out
Well, it's a small sample size, but I'm going to work on this. I'm going to work on this.
because I am definitely an internal monologue person. I think in words all the time. Pictures too, but there is always running verbal thought process going on.
Yep, same here. Now, I've got a couple of stories myself. Do you want me to go into one of mine?
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the stories, both like I said, both of mine are by Elias Witherow, and I'm going to say one more time, if we could ever get him on here for to join us for an episode of podcast for an interview, it would be amazing because he's one of my not just one of my favorite creepypasta authors, but he very quickly became one of my favorite authors. The first story I'm going to talk about was called Feed the Pig, and it's in a universe of stories called The Black Farm. Now, this is why I was saying that I'm going to be talking about the stories around the stories because it's important information to have. But the Black Farm is essentially, and again, trigger warnings, anything by Elias Witherow, just assume every trigger is there. The Black Farm is something between heaven and hell, and it's where people who committed suicide went. And like it's explained in such a way as God had his rules set where that was a sin, and both him and the devil decided it wasn't fair that they should burn for eternity for, suffering and not being able to handle it. So they created this place they call the Black Farm, which is very Earth-like at first. It's just a place where the people go to live. It's kind of like purgatory. But they stopped sort of administrating it. They lost focus and stopped paying attention to it. So people being people all went crazy, and it basically turns into the lament configuration from Hellraiser. There's all this freaky imagery. The freaky imagery, by the way, one of my favorite parts. And this guy wakes up there after, attempting obviously what we were talking about. And the idea is he has a choice. He can either stay there or he can do what they call feeding the pig, which is exactly what it sounds like. There's this giant, hideous, half humanoid pig creature at the center of the black farm. And what he sees in the meantime is people shooting each other with shotguns, people crawling around on their bellies because their arms and legs have been chopped off and trying to eat his toes. Like, I'm telling you, the imagery in this, the body horror images, just chef's kiss, but I needed a shower when I was done. So he decides, I'm not ready to die and I'm not ready to be here. But if you feed the pig, one of three things could happen. You're going to actually crawl into this giant pig's mouth and get eaten. And you're either going to end up in hell, you're going to end up disappeared forever, just completely gone, or you might get a second chance. And what his guide kind of tells him is, hell and none of these are worse than this. Hell isn't worse. Disappearing forever isn't worse. And you have that slight chance you'll go back to Earth. And he basically tells him, and I don't condone this kind of language towards people who are suffering with that. Again, we've said it before. You can call 988 if this is something you're dealing with. It's not a joke and it's not something just to be used in fiction. Okay. I just want to be clear on that. But he tells him, you can stop being a coward and go ahead and try something for once in your life. Gives him that speech. Again, don't condone that. And he does. He climbs into the pig's mouth and thoroughly describes being chewed, being crushed by his esophagus, being digested, his skin melting, the heat from it. And he wakes up on the floor of his shed with a sore throat. I'm sure you can put two and two together there and get hanging. And that is the start of these stories, because actually Elias Witherow went on to write novels that involved characters going to the black farm to save somebody from it. And it's really, the concept is brilliant and the execution is brilliant. He did everything right. Again, one of my favorite writers of all time.
I have several thoughts about that. One, I love the idea that whatever humans would do unsupervised is so much worse than hell. I like that. I like the viewpoint that has on kind of human nature. So that part's really cool. Also, whenever you're describing the black farm and the fact of that this is where suicides go and how it was originally meant to be like a thing of clemency and mercy, and of course humans turned it horrible, also made me. Have you ever seen What Dreams May Come, the Robin Williams movie?
I know of it, never watched it.
Um, it's about the afterlife, and the entire thing with that is pretty much everyone goes to heaven except suicide. Suicides go to hell, and of course, his question is how is this fair? And that the idea being, it's not that this is punishment; it's that suicides, by definition of what they did, can't let go, and it's kind of their own creation. It's not punishment. It's not because they did something wrong. It's because by the very nature of how they left the world, they can't let go, and they are in a hell of their own making. And as far as things that deal with that go, I thought that was pretty well done.
It's interesting. Again, I know that I've said this several times already. People, there's help out there. You can text 988 if you don't want to talk to anybody. Reach out if you're dealing with this stuff, but we're here to talk about horror stories. We're going to get back to that.
Absolutely. All right. Another one of the underrated creepypastas that I want to talk about is called Sloppy Joe's. And this is a very short, very simple story that I love for a very weirdly specific reason. Here's how the story starts. There's this guy going to this weird restaurant where they have these weirdly delicious Sloppy Joes. And he's going there, he's becoming obsessed with it, and he's eating them over and over and over again. And he just keeps coming there. And as he's eating them, he's getting fatter and fatter and more obese. And he's becoming just incredibly huge. And he keeps going there, even past the point where he knows, one, it's bad for his health, and then even where he starts realizing this is going to kill him. And he keeps going there, and there's that moment where he realizes that it's going to happen, and then he's talking to the waitress, and she's like, yeah, no, it's totally going to happen, pointing to a wall of people who have eaten themselves to death there, and him just kind of going, well, not much I can do about that, and just keeps doing it, and the implication is that he eats himself to death. Now, I really like, and that's the whole story. That's all there is to it. Now, I really like this for a couple of reasons. One, because you immediately think this is going to have something to do with cannibalism. Because as soon as I told you the story about Sloppy Joe's, I'm sure your mind went to cannibalism too, because that's the only way these kind of stories ever go. Anytime there's a creepy story about food, it's got to be cannibalism. Which, don't get me wrong, cannibalism's scary, cannibalism's creepy, and there are some great stories about cannibalism. The Wendigo legends are about cannibalism. There's some great stuff, but it's been so done and so overused that it's actually a really cool subversion of expectation to go, nah, The sloppy joes aren't about cannibalism. They're just about addiction and obesity and, killing yourself even when you know something isn't good for you and doing it anyway. And I just think that's so much more interesting to make it about addiction and that kind of thing. So I feel like they went with a much more mature story there. And one of the reasons I love it is because I love when a story can take what you know is going to be a tire trope, which you know exactly where it's going from the beginning, and then they take it in a different direction. Because whenever we have a person eating something horrible, it's just always cannibalism. I want to talk about another story by Dean Koontz where he handles this very, very badly. Basically he has his Dr. Frankenstein type character who is very evil, and he's trying to show that he's very evil. So this guy goes to this like weird Chinese food restaurant where he wants to have this really taboo meal. And as he's sitting down to have this very taboo meal that like they don't even really want to serve him, but they have to. And so you just know it's going to be cannibalism or worse, right? You know it's going to be something really horrible until they bring out the food and it's baby mice. And the whole thing is he's eating baby mice and like frying them and eating them with jasmine rice. And don't get me wrong, is that a little bit gross? A little bit to me. I mean, to my American palate, eating baby mice sounds really horrible. But I mean, it's just mice. It's a mammal. It's not that weird. It's not that big of a deal. And because we were expecting cannibalism when he gave us baby mice, it was just such a letdown and so silly and just ruined the tension of the moment because instead of managing to subvert the expectation with something worse than cannibalism, he lowballed it so hard, but he was kind of backed into a box because of the expectation that of course it's going to be cannibalism. And I want to talk about a episode of Doctor Who that did a good job of subverting an expectation, being the first one ever to do it. Now, this wasn't with cannibalism. This was with a trope I've seen in a lot of stories. Now, unfortunately, we're going to mention suicide again. As Hatter has said lots of times, there is help. If you're struggling with any of this stuff, please seek it out. But we are still going to talk about it being in media, and it is such a huge part of the human experience. It is just something we have to talk about. And what Doctor Who was dealing with was the premise of there being this book that when you read, that everyone who reads the book then commits suicide. That's a trope we've seen before. I've seen all kinds of stories about the book that makes you kill yourself. And normally it's never explained. That's the whole idea because it's really hard to come up with an interesting explanation for that. In most stories, it's just, oh, it's evil. Oh, it just does that, whatever. And those are so boring. It's even better to not explain it if you're going to. But Doctor Who had this book where people were doing this. And then it explained it. And it was the only one I've ever seen explain it well. And basically, their explanation was that if you read this book, it had proof in it that you were living in a simulation being run by evil aliens who were using this simulation to figure out how to invade and destroy Earth. You found out you're not real, but you're being used to forward their goals of destroying the Earth. So when people read this, they would realize they were in a simulation and they would kill themselves to take themselves out of the simulation. Now, of course, I don't like the fact that suicide is presented as a good thing in this. Again, that's not ever the way to go, and there is help out there. But it was an interesting way to actually explain and subvert the expectation of the book that makes you kill yourself and give it a logical explanation. So I think that's an episode that did something really cool with the trope that I loved. And it's kind of the same thing, circling back to the Sloppy Joes, is they managed to avoid the boring trope of cannibalism and go with something much more interesting. And that's why it's on my list of underrated creepypastas.
That's definitely an interesting one, and it definitely takes it in a direction that I appreciate a lot more than just like, it's some weird word that messes with your mind, or it's facts about humanity that just make you do the thing. Um, on a similar note, and this is going to be something more for cursed media, so I'm just going to gloss over it. Have you ever heard of the song Gloomy Sunday?
Vaguely.
So it's known as the Hungarian suicide song, and there's this idea that the song makes you kill yourself. Now, that's not true, obviously. The original person who composed it did, but he composed a very sad, very unhappy song about his mindset. And the idea people jump to, oh, it must be the song. No, he wrote the song because of the way he was feeling, but still, again, something more for like cursed and lost media. It is actually a
Okay,
very beautifully composed song, but I'm sorry, go ahead.
that makes me think of people having the weirdest relationship with causation and correlation because I am a bald man. As anyone who's seen any of my videos can see, I am bald. And I have heard so many people tell me so many times, "Oh, wearing a hat all the time causes baldness." Because they know bald guys who wear hats and think the hat caused them to be bald, never realizing that, it might be that a bald man might rather wear a hat and getting the causation totally backwards.
Exactly. It's way too common to mix up causation and correlation. But anyway, sorry, just a little side rabbit hole there. I have one more that was again from the same author, Elias Witherow. Very good story. Now, I know I warned ahead of time about triggers in these stories. This one is very, very, very over the top. Depending on which story we're talking about. I know Gray read one of them. I think you read the second one. The first one tends to be a little more on that side, but let's just go ahead. Trigger warning, literally everything, particularly stuff pertaining to children. So if you're not ready for that, stop listening, skip ahead. But the story that I'm talking about is called The Third Parent, and there's a series of stories around it about a character by the name of Tommy Taffy, which it's amazing that you could take something named Tommy Taffy and make it terrifying. But, the way to imagine him, he's like kinda looks like he's a living doll. He has no pores on his face, all of his teeth are one piece, and he just shows up at these people's house, and he says, "I'm gonna be your third parent. I'm gonna teach your family how to be good," basically, and, his whole thing is discipline, like, he's beating on them and stuff like that, uh, and the whole idea is that, again, he is there to help them, quote, unquote, "be good," which is as creepy as it sounds. So throughout the story, he's beating the kids, he's beating the parents, he's being inappropriate with them in ways that I'm sure you can put two and two together. And one of the scariest moments is when they find out that everybody on the block, he's also there simultaneously. There's not more than one of him. He's just capable of being in all these places at once, which in and of itself gives you the willies. And throughout the story, these things tend to continue. At one point, the dad decides the whole block decides they've had enough. Rightly so. I mean, this guy is not good. So they tie him to a chair and burn him. And guess where he is the next day? Care to hazard a guess, Gray?
I'm going to guess right back at the front door.
Right back at the front door, and that doesn't end well for anyone. He ends up impaling the father on a broomstick, I think it was. I don't remember thoroughly. And just continuing to do his thing, which gets worse and worse. And I'm trying to dance around the things he did, but I'm sure again, y'all can put two and two together. And just like that, in that particular story, he ends up just gone. He's just not there anymore. But as Gray knows, he read one of the sequels. He knows that he continues to show up. And there's an entire novel after the four stories they had on the internet. So, and I just, to me, it's really cool it's really interesting how Elias Witherow took both real world things like the idea of an abusive parent and abusive elder, an abusive partner, and rolled that in with like weird, somewhat Lovecraftian, somewhat demonic things, and rolled that into a character who, when he described him, scares you in an entirely different way. And it's just a really, really dark combination of supernatural and natural that just, again, you're going to need a shower when you finish reading it, but very well done. Very well done.
And I do want to talk a little bit about the sequel because it's, of course, the one that I read, and it has some elements that I think are super important. And basically, the idea of the sequel being that two of the children from the original story grew up, got married, and had kids. And the idea is that if you have kids, Tommy Taffy will show back up. So they have two children, and a boy and a girl. And when those children are 10 and probably about 8 or so, I don't know that they ever give specifically the age of the girl, Tommy Taffy shows back up. And that being the thing that he will show up to quote unquote help you raise your children. So, and the idea being he's only going to stay for about 5 years, about a set period of time. And somehow the parents know that. I don't know if they're ever super clear. Maybe that's from the first story. But he shows up to quote unquote help them raise their children. And the thing about the story is, and this is so interesting, and what I think makes this not just a good story, but a great story, it is very much allegory for domestic abuse, and not only just abuse, but specifically generational abuse. Because one, there's a lot of weird things about Tommy Taffy that if you try to take it literally, are weird, they're cool, they're cosmic horror, they're Lovecraftian, but if you kind of understand it as a little bit of, I'm not sure if you're all familiar with the Babadook, but it was a really good horror movie, and the whole point of the Babadook is the monster from the Babadook is meant just to be an allegory for grief. Once you know that, all the rules, all the weird rules surrounding the monster make a lot more sense when you realize it just represents grief over death. And kind of the same thing with Tommy Taffy. Once you realize he's just an allegory for abuse, a lot of the stuff, like the fact that he is simultaneously in every house, because it's something that can very easily infect an entire community. The fact that he shows back up every generation, because that kind of trauma often, not always, but often leads to generational abuse. And again, we can again take him even kind of literally, because he is the person who abused them and then continues to abuse their children. And grandparent to grandchild abuse is like shockingly and like horrifyingly common, because often the person will abuse their child, and then that child, being an abused person, doesn't know how to stand up to them, and then will allow them to abuse their own child. So I mean, this is so a perfect allegory for abuse. And I don't think that you can't convince me that whoever wrote this did not have personal experience with abuse, because it's, I mean, and there's so many horrifying parts about it. They're horrifying in their implication, like them talking about, well, we just knew we weren't supposed to talk about Tommy when we were at school. Tommy only existed at home. When we were there, it was almost like he wasn't real, and then when we got home, we would get hit with it. And him having the excuse of, I'm going to teach you how to be a good person, while in reality he's horrifyingly abusing them. And one of the most horrifying things to me is that the narrator, who is the 10-year-old boy, talking about throughout this entire time, it was only his father's submission to Tommy that kept them alive. That if we had fought, if we had struck back and tried to actually protect ourselves, we would have all died. So only by completely giving in and submitting were we able to stay alive. And that is so horrifying, because that is the mentality of so many people who are facing domestic abuse. So it's just absolutely tragic, horrifying, terrible, because it is so accurate to what people really go through. Another thing I want to talk about that's related, so that's just the allegory element is fantastic. Something else I want to talk about is, as you could hear in Hatter's voice, it was super disturbing, and it was very disturbing. And the reason it was so disturbing is because Elias Withrow knows the technique, which is known to the best writers, of knowing when to gloss over elements and when to be super graphic. And one of the things he would do is like be very, very, very graphic at less bad moments. Still bad, obviously, still terrible moments, but would get super graphic on the lighter moments, and then on the really, really bad moments, would gloss over it and leave it to your imagination. Would imply what happened and discuss what happened, but that would be a fade to black. That would be something the narrator doesn't see. But the lesser moments you would see in painstaking, terrifying detail. And that's going to make you leave, as the reader, leave feeling like you saw some horrible shit, even though what you saw, you didn't see most of the worst stuff. But because it was graphic with the little stuff and skipped the big stuff, you feel worse than if he had just showed you the big stuff. And that's what gives you that visceral, unnerving, disturbing feel. And he just did a fantastic job.
Yeah, absolutely. It just, and I think I just want to kind of point out, because I've talked about like what horror does with these subjects before, and I think fiction in general, actually, what it does with these subjects, despite how disturbing the story was, by adding a creature like Tommy Taffy, makes it approachable, and like not approachable as in something that you can listen to and not feel grossed out, but approachable as in it becomes something you can talk about. Like the way we're talking about this now, we're talking about a monster and a horror story, but we're addressing some pretty important subjects with it. And typically, when people are talking about subjects like abuse, they tend to try to shy away from it, like, oh, that's unpleasant. Let's not talk about it. But if you can turn it into something like this, it gets people talking. It's a service it does.
Well, that's one of my things on why allegory is so important and why good allegory is so important. And we will do another episode. I could actually do a whole episode on allegory, and especially allegory in horror movies. But good allegory is so important because it lets us talk about issues that it would be harder to talk about without it. All right, and the last underrated creepypasta that I want to cover is called Aquarium. Now, again, like a lot of the ones I picked for this underrated series, it's very short, but that's because I feel like people know the longer ones because people enjoy reading the longer ones, people enjoy listening to them, especially listening to people read them on YouTube, which, by the way, shout out to Creeps McPasta. He's where I consume most of my creepy pastas and where I got a lot of these from, just because I love him. He does a fantastic job, and he has a very pleasant British accent, which I just find relaxing.
Let's also shout out Mr. Creepypasta because I get quite a bit from him as well as
Cool.
Creeps McPasta.
He's another excellent one. I also agreed. Let's shout him out because those two are just fantastic.
It'd be cool if we could get either of them to be on the podcast too. But anyway, go ahead.
Exactly. If either of them are listening, we'd love to have you as well. So I'm going to talk about a story called Aquarium. Now, Aquarium is a pretty basic story where it's about this guy who originally had fish and then eventually all his fish died, but he left the light on in his tank, the filter turned off, and just neglected his aquarium. And when he came back, it was growing this weird brown algae all over the place. And it looked really weird and almost alien. And he stuck his hand in to see what was going on. And the algae started growing up his hand and growing into his hand. And then these leech like creatures started hatching out of the algae. And these eggs started forming on it. And these tiny fish swam around and were eaten by the leeches. And the leeches started crawling into his skin. And all these things started like moving slowly up his arm. And like there's this entire thing where he's slowly being kind of absorbed into the aquarium, and he gets this feeling of euphoria where this is paradise to be joined with this perfect ecosystem as he's being parasitized and having this weird euphoria, presumably as these things are taking over his brain. And that's the story. And I think and it's super short, super simple, but again, I find that really horrifying for a couple of weird reasons. One, we actually looked it up earlier, but I forget what the name was for the phobia of basically of a messy house, of poor housekeeping, and of unsanitary conditions. And my lovely wife, just having looked it up for me, apparently that's called ataxophobia, where it is a fear of dirty, filthy, untidy, unsanitary conditions. And that's one of the things that this draws on. And that's such a common thing. You know, it's kind of the fear of the whole hoarder household thing that those shows were all about. So there's that where it tying into that. So I think that's a cool thing. That's something we don't see enough, I think, be tied into because that's a more common fear than I think people really think about. And tying into that fear is aquariums. Now, I used to own an aquarium. I loved keeping fish. I thought it was super cool. But I think that people who don't own aquariums do not understand how inherently filthy an aquarium is. I was a young teenager whenever I kept a freshwater aquarium. I had tetras. I loved my tetras. I had the little algae eaters and the little catfish. I absolutely adored my fish. But some of my weirdest childhood trauma comes from that frickin' aquarium, including it always would develop the weirdest growths. And I know why this person chose brown algae, because algae growing on everything is so weird, including if you're not careful about cleaning your tank, the algae will try to escape the freaking tank. And it's just disgusting. And it's one of the reasons why I will, as an adult, not own a freaking aquarium. And it's just, they can be so unsafe. No matter how hard, you can do your best to keep them clean, and you can, but there's always going to be just this really weird crap going on with your aquarium because you're bringing the ocean into your house, and that's just not normal. I will also say that I had a weird thing where I bought the wrong fish and put it in a communal tank, and it began killing all my other fish, and seeing half a catfish swimming around, still trying to swim, is still one of the most traumatizing things that has ever happened to me, and I'm still not okay with it.
Understandable.
So that's why I think Aquarium is a fantastic, underrated, and at least traumatizing to me creepypasta.
Yeah, I would say that first of all, it's good because it touches on something that is fairly commonplace and makes it scary. You know, aquariums. Most people, like you said, they don't think aquariums are scary. It's just, this peaceful little thing. Oh, no, but it's going to take over your body and kill you. That obviously very rarely happens in the real world, like 1 in 10,000 chance. But same idea. It's something. It takes something that's fairly common and makes it worse. And it kind of reminds me of a Stephen King story involving a meteorite. Long story short, this was in one of the compilation things that plants take over his body and he ends up shooting himself. except it's, it doesn't end as happily as, oh, hey, I'm happy. It's euphoric. I mean, it's not happy, but it's happy for him.
That's in Creepshow, and Creepshow is an iconic horror anthology, and we're definitely going to have to talk about Creepshow.
Absolutely. And there is one other creepypasta I know. Don't worry, I'm not going to stretch the episode. I'm just going to talk very quickly about it. But you made me think of it when you said ataxophobia. There's a creepypasta I read years ago called Meek, and that actually touches on even more of those things. It's about this guy. He's sitting there playing an online game. He's like terribly obese, like, because all he's done is played this game forever. He's let his house go to pot. Like, I'm not going to go into detail. It gets gross for even my tastes, but his house is like a huge mess and he can't get to his phone. And it gets worse and worse as he finds that he hasn't cleaned his house in this many years, and the corpses of his wife and his daughter are in there, and he never bothered to clean it up or anything. He has a heart attack and dies in the middle of the room. That's the story. It's very short. But yeah, similar kind of a taxophobic thing.
Well, and that's straight ataxophobia, and that's basically just the entire thing is it's a hoarder. That's done entirely realistically, which is interesting in that it's just a very realistic, horrifying moment. But in some ways, I think it could be more interesting, again, if they add a supernatural element. But I like for both of those to exist. Those are two very different ways of attacking the same kind of phobia.
Taxing the same kind of phobia.
Attacophobia? I don't know where I'm going with that.
Neither do I. But yeah, there's 5 plus a very short bonus one. Do you have anything else to add, Gray?
Nope, I believe that's it. I hope you guys enjoyed this venture into the rabbit hole of underrated creepypastas. If we missed a creepypasta that you think is underrated, let us know. And if you already knew some of these, let us know in the comments.
And we want to thank you once again for tuning into the Station Between Stations for another rabbit hole.